Their mission statement says that fact-based information is the fuel democracies run on, how society confronts problems and how society tries to solve those problems. For more than 30 years, the Pew Research Center, often called something else, I remember it as People in the Press when I was a reporter, has been tracking societal attitudes and what makes people tick. For the last 20 years, Pew Research has been tracking what is happening inside the media world, inside the industry, and getting inside the heads of news consumers along with their habits. Amy Mitchell is the director of journalism research at the Pew Research Center. She looks at things like social media and the use of new research methods, and she's with us today. Great to have you. As I just said, we've been dealing with Pew for a very long time.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yes, and this is your work too. I noticed that your degree is in government, so you've got that connection to what it really means. Let us take a look at a few of the key points, because you put out your information in really nice bite-sized chunks so that people can figure it out. Digital news, and I'm going to say just to our audience that the references will all be US because that's where you are, but we will see those trends here in Canada as well. In the US, roughly 9 in 10 adults gets at least some news online, and it has become kind of the host for both legacy and new outlets. 9 out of 10 is a pretty high number.
That's right. It is. Online has really, for years, as we were tracking sort of, television, local television in particular, but television overall, had really been that had the widest reach by far across the American public. And then we started to see that number go down some and online come up, and then got to a point where we are at more people now who say that they get news regularly online than from television. So it's really become a primary way of people being informed. Now, online has a lot of different facets to it.
Right.
You've got social media, you've got websites and apps and all these different ways that people can find news, or news can find people in these spaces.
Is this really driven by just it's simpler? It's a question of convenience. It's there. You can take your phone with you. You don't have a big newspaper to read.
There's a lot to that. When we ask people in the digital space about seeking out news versus happening upon it, that was one of the things that we recognized very early in not just the digital area, but the social media area in particular, was there was much more an increase in people who were happening upon news, particularly in social media spaces. So not saying, I'm going to take my dedicated half hour and sit down and read the newspaper or watch the local news or whatever it is, but news is kind of coming at you over the course of the day, and one may or may not be looking for it.
I think what we've all experienced in COVID is, well, people working from home, as you and I are doing today, but also the exposure that we've all had and the time we've all had to do it. We're seeing the reaction of parents as they've been able to actually watch what their kids are being taught and what they're learning, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and just a little bit more time to do it. But that has also put the focus on, what are we reading? There is no arbiter right now of what we all get on social media.
That's true. And one of the other changes that this has brought is this constant flow. And when we think about COVID in particular, as well as, other types of news, but we certainly see many Americans, large majority saying they feel overwhelmed by news today. And we certainly can feel that in COVID in particular. And also this sense among those who are producing it and putting it out there that they've got to have some update, every hour or every half hour, every 10 minutes. And that really changes the dynamic of both reporting and collecting news, as well as people's sense of processing it. So it can, it can create a lot of opportunity, but it can also lead to this, I can't escape it kind of mentality as well.
And the contradictory nature of the information that you can find. I mean, you can go online and be told that, vaccines are the most wonderful thing since the invention of bread, and they're going to save your life. And then the next story is it's going to kill you. This is
that's
really
right.
hard.
It's also, it's important to point out that in addition to social media, there's a lot of dedicated news there too, right? And the dedicated news outlets that people can subscribe to, whether it's through their apps or through other subscription-based models, and choose them as the sources that they're going to rely on and turn to. So it's a combination. There are certainly people who are primarily social media not doing so much of that, dedicated choice when it comes to sources, but that certainly exists online as well. So it's navigating that line. And then when you are in that social media space, or even through emails or other ways that people may have these things come at them, it does require more on the part of the consumer to sift through it, to make sense of it, to figure out am I going to check this? Do I accept this as reality? Those kind of choices are a bigger part of the news consumer's day than perhaps they were in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've been writing about and thinking about for a long time myself, which is, you are your own editor and you are your own filter. But what we see in the general public, and it's more obvious in the US than it is here, I think, because of your two-party system and the dichotomy that's there. But people tend to seek out, even in times of issues like COVID, they tend to seek out the echo chamber, the source that reflects kind of what their gut tells them or what their thinking already is.
We've certainly seen an increase in the separation of choices for news sources based on your political identity. Really beginning, we saw it in 2014, even before that 2016 election, where people were fairly divided ideologically in the sources that they were choosing to turn to. And not just turn to, but trust, and then distrust. And when we redid that particular study in 2019 and published it in 2020, what we saw was those divides increasing, both in the level of in the choices people are making based on, that connected to their political identity, as well as the level of trust they express, and in particular, also the level of distrust of those that they may not be turning to. So there's definitely I'm going to have my space, that, my sources that I trust. And one of the things we saw in COVID was it's not just your more traditional types of news outlet. You have people like Trump and the White House task force that were, the main way a large segment of the population was getting their news, particularly among those that are Republican. You had people that were relying on their local government officials, people that are relying on the CDC and other kinds of health science outlets like that. So there are these other players in the news and information stream today in a way that people are relying on.
But trust has almost become who do I agree with, rather than that more arm's length relationship, which is, I'm going to read the New York Times, or I'm going to watch the CBC, or whatever their old view of the world was. Trust is now, I like you.
It's interesting because we cannot tie a precise causal direction, right? If you're looking at sort of, I'm a Democrat and I choose to turn to these three outlets, I'm a Republican, I choose to turn to these three outlets, and I had these views before I turned to them and I agree with them. We don't have that. You can't necessarily tie that directly when you're doing survey work. But what we do see are two different things, that people's views, and if we use COVID as an example, people's sense of what they see as reality, right? So one thing is it being made a bigger deal than it should be? That was a question we asked several times over, beginning in March of 2020. Those who relied on Trump and the task force primarily for their news, much more likely to say it's been made too big of a deal compared with those who turn to other types of sources. And that's true even within those who call themselves Republicans or lean Republican. So the sources you're turning to, we found, particularly in the last presidential election in the US, as well as around COVID-19, correspond quite strongly in many cases with your views about what's happening and your sense of that reality.
And as the news media itself deals with economic and audience issues, the fragmentation, then it's almost it is in their interest then to find an audience and cater to it.
Yeah, that I can't speak to the decisions that news organizations
Right.
are making, and we do less on, I'm not going, there are some organizations that call themselves, an organization that is of this type ideologically, but we have done content studies where we look at the type of, what the coverage is that they're putting out. And there we do see differences when we group these outlets based on their audience makeup. So for example, in the first 100 days of the Biden administrations, we've done this first 100-day study, going back to
Right.
Clinton's first term. And what you see is there are a lot of differences in the sources they're citing, the evaluations that come out of those news stories, based when you group them around the type of audience. So these news outlets are reporting in many cases about the same overall storyline, but offering different sources and overall different evaluations based on those sources.
I can't help but ask you, because in the last few days we've seen that even the networks that are associated with being pro-democratic versus, say, a Fox News, but the polls that have come out about Joe Biden and his falling popularity, the thing that struck me is the turnaround. So one that I saw the other day was minus, down 7 points for Joe Biden, up 7 points for Republicans, et cetera. That seems a fast turnaround in the course of just 1 year, less than, for voting habits or connections, identities to shift. That's a huge chunk.
It's interesting. And, these are the kind of questions that we at the center have, been asking about different administrations and leaders and elected leaders for decades. It is, we try to focus more on the longer term trend as opposed to kind of a week to week bump or this is going up or this is going down week to week, because one story in the news could shift the public reaction at that point. That then comes back. And so we try to look at give a longer lens to the direction of the American public, both when it comes to evaluations of leaders as well as views about issues, but there has certainly been a shift over the year in the, approval rating, if you will, of President Biden.
Let me just take a sideline here for a moment, because you just talked about the complications of survey work. We've seen a lot of pollsters in this country who've been off base because they don't have the traditional ways of reaching out to people. Phoning home lines, which so many people don't even have anymore, was a traditional basis for asking questions. I still get them on all my all numbers, both cell and home lines. But how difficult is it now doing survey work when people know what you're after? You're trying to, they can tell from your questions where, what issues you're on. They may want to mislead you deliberately because they don't like this interference in their life. They may, it's just a very different game than it was 20 or 25 years ago.
Well, certainly, the methods of survey collection and survey research have evolved as well. We do all of our most of all of our survey work online now. It is critical to be very not just thoughtful, but directive in choosing and creating your sample of the population. We have an in-house panel that is nationally representative, that is recruited through address-based sampling, so that we really work to be fully representative, and have over 20,000 that are in this at this point. So it is something that the center puts a lot of time and resources into.
Is that like your control group, or you mean that's your base?
So yeah, so the American Trends panel is the main way we survey the public, is through that very large sample of people across the country that are recruited to be nationally representative, and then certainly weighted as well. We do some other survey work at times with other vendors when we need sort of special population work, for example. But we house that, we manage it, and use a vendor to actually do the questionnaire. So it is a really, really important part of the process.
So you've got a willing group as opposed to just picking up the phone and calling people at 8 o'clock at night.
They have agreed, yes, they have agreed to be on the panel. And they do get small compensation for, when they do survey work. And we also, we are refreshing every year. There are people that we, pull off the panel after a certain amount of time. So we are also always updating and, managing sort of that profile of the panel itself.
So what has surprised you most in the last, we'll just take the last, 18 months, 2 years with COVID, about attitudes or the change that you might have seen in your survey population, and therefore in the population at large, about how they view the media or trust or any of these issues that you're trying to grapple with?
Well, one of the really kind of dramatic areas of findings that we saw consistently over the course. So we launched what we called the American Pathways Project, which was initially going to be following people's views and behaviors when it came to news about the 2020 election. And then COVID happened. And so, of course, we still had some of the election in there, but did a lot more focus on the pandemic. And one of the things that we look at is, people's views and their sense of reality connected to the sources that they rely on most for that news. And it is really dramatic to see some of the differences based on where people are turning for their news. And it's not only if you look just sort of, there are more people turning to Fox News on the Republican. There are more people that are going to New York Times or NPR on the Democratic side. But even within people's partisanship, differences based on what they say are their primary sources for news. So that is, what we certainly all witnessed, the really strong divides people had, and in many cases, sort of animosity to people that sensed something else about the virus and the pandemic and the ways to respond or to not respond. A lot of those correlated very closely with the sources that they were relying on for their news. So when you have something like a world health crisis, and you see people's sensibility of that, as well as their behavior. So one of the other things we did was we took data where we had asked people, where they rely on, and I'm using the Trump and the White House administration as an example, but there certainly you can see these kind of things emerge when you look at other sources like social media as their primary source, et cetera. But we then looked at vaccination rates this past summer, and those who relied primarily on Trump and the White House for their COVID-19 news were the least likely to have been vaccinated, were less likely than others. So it's not only in views, but also in behaviors and the choices people are making about how to respond to it. Those that rely primarily on social media tended to have greater exposure to certain areas of disinformation and misinformation when it came to that topic.
And some of that inevitably is in the eye of the beholder. That's, if you're looking at the world in a certain lens, if you're a Fox viewer and you've decided that you're not going to get vaccinated, you can find sources that will say, look, this is an experimental drug. We've only had 2 years, those arguments. I don't mean crazy conspiracy stuff. I mean, there are medical professionals raising that, versus the Democratic side, the CNN, MSNBC listener, who became more compliant with what the state was asking of them in terms of masks or vaccination or whatever. What are you learning then about this divide that you referred to in America, which we can all see, and it's true in every country? Are those divides that were there and it's been exacerbated by this, or has this created the divide, the chicken and egg?
In many cases, the divides of where people are choosing to go for their news and certain attitudes they had and behaviors existed prior. We were seeing the political polarization move into people's news choices and spaces, going back to when we first did this, ask these types of questions in 2014, as I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. So we have seen them. We do continue to see it get greater. We have seen the level of trust among Republicans, when you ask about trust in the news media generally, decline even further when we asked this and asked the question most recently in 2021. So there continues to be a divide with directions moving both ways when you look at it politically. One of the other things that I think is interesting and important to consider when it comes to misinformation, and we think about the pandemic, is there are also parts of the population that are seeking, that want to find out the truth, for lack of a better word, right? They want to find out what is it? What is real? Should I do this? Should I not do this?
Are these vaccines okay?
Right. Are they not okay? And, if one of the parts of the population that other research has shown to be, in some cases, more affected and impacted and vulnerable to misinformation are Black Americans. And there's a deep-seated, distrust in many cases for government or for science and for health, when in the past they have had historical misrepresentations when it comes to their population and their ethnicity. So there are these other areas of the population where there is a sense of question and distrust and a desire to know the truth, but a real sense of confusion. And that can often be exacerbated in a number of different ways, because of the news that they have available to them, because of actors that are seeking to look into those vulnerable groups and feed them a lot of disinformation. So there's different parts of the population that are being affected by both the environment of news today and historical place in society.
So when COVID is over, if we ever get to that time, I'm not sure
you can say
that, but when we decide it's endemic as opposed to pandemic, do you think these divides will lessen? Has this just become a real kind of focal point at the moment? And it's, COVID has become sort of the shorthand for the political divides, right? It's the easy way to have to make those distinctions. Do you think that divide is now in place, that people have essentially lost trust, I don't think it matters which side of the spectrum they're on, in institutions, in big institutions, in government, in the healthcare? We're seeing that in our country, where we're very, we brag about our healthcare system and, how that distinguishes us as a country, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard at the end of all of this to say, this has been a source that you could really trust, because the information has changed so radically and dramatically.
Yeah, it is a challenge, and to think about the overall implications of it longer term, certainly with the election happening at the same time.
Yeah.
We did see a number of areas of divide in people's sense about what was happening around the election, the mail ballot question, and the issue that came up in terms of the claims of mail ballots being tied much to a much larger degree to errors and false voting and those types of things. That really wasn't shown to be the case in the evidence, where people's views on that, again, differed in a way that connected closely to where they were turning for their news. So I don't think this is something that is just about COVID. It is certainly it's something that we're seeing more pervasive. And the question of trust in institutions is, as you say, a broader one. And there are lots of areas across the world where we're seeing, declines in people's sense of, I trust this greater. A lot of it has to do with kind of that populism element of I could do this just as well as an elected leader. I don't need to turn to an institution to tell me how to do this. And that's something that I think, public writ large has often, in many cases has gained more confidence in their own ability, or less confidence and trust in institutions. The news media tends to be one of those that has, in the US anyway, has declined to a larger degree than others, and where there is very large partisan divide. We even saw, when we asked about people's main news source, and then we asked a list of outlets, and we asked if they considered any of these outlets, which of these outlets they considered to be a part of the mainstream news, and which they considered to be outside the mainstream news. And then we also asked them their main news source. And people, particularly Republicans, were much less likely to express trust in their main news source that they named if they had said it was a part of the mainstream news media. So there is this just, natural kind of, negative, don't trust, push away. Even in
if
your
it's
own
the home team.
Right. Even when it's your home team, if you think they're a part of the mainstream news media. So that was a fascinating finding, in my view.
No, that's the risk of these organizations, whether left or right, putting on the jerseys, is that if you love or hate big institutions or trust them less than you ever have, then they're going to pay the price too. And that's what your numbers keep saying about, cable news versus network news. Network news, the ultimate mainstream media, is really the one that's impacted most in terms of loss of audience.
Yeah, it's interesting. And at the same time, when I think about a question we've asked a couple of times now, if we think about the digital space and misinformation, disinformation, whichever term you want to use for that, we've asked the American public about whether they think the government should take steps to restrict misinformation online, even if it means some restrictions on freedom to access or publish information. And we asked the same thing about tech companies. And when we asked this initially, there was the solid majority of Americans said they'd rather not have the government take steps to restrict misinformation, so that freedom to access and publish information was protected. That has shifted now. When we asked this in 2021, so that there's now about an even divide among the public between wanting the government to take action or not. So when you put that, the flip side of which is greater to protect versus having government, a movement to allow it, and also an acceptance for technology companies, or a view that technology companies should take steps as well to be able to restrict.
We've wrestled with this issue a lot on this podcast, and I'm dealing with it also as a senator in terms of legislation that comes in front of us. And I guess the problem for everybody really comes down to who's the arbiter, who decides whether your Twitter feed should be shut down, or what is disinformation and what is different information than what the mainstream is proposing. Somebody has to be an arbiter, and then that becomes the problem. Is it government? Do you want the industry itself to do it? There's a lot of, this issue is fraught.
Yeah, it's extremely fraught, and just a massive challenge for the world, let alone our country. And the decisions that one country make when you're in these digital spaces is obviously can affect the full of countries, right? The full of the world, because it's digital. It is, and it's making a decision, but it's also the amount of content there is on whatever platform you're, considering to make decisions about every hour. that the level of information that's coming in, that's being posted, is massive. So even if a decision about who the arbiter should be is made, then how you make those, the rules around that, and the ability to stay on top of it is a massive challenge.
I mean, we were having this conversation with Daphne Keller from Stanford, who does a lot of work on the legal issues around this. And, she cited some examples of, a website that had been created to talk about the horrors of the Holocaust, and using the video and the language around that. And that website was shut down because of the violence. I mean, you're just talking about an algorithm who can't make, or doesn't make this distinction between history and fact versus random violence and inciting people to it.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. And we have seen in some cases, particularly around elections, both in the US and elsewhere in Europe, where journalists have tried to come together to help, to work together in that way when you have a particular topic area. But that's just one very small sliver of what's coming in.
What's your personal view in this? You've been around. I mean, do you think we need regulation? Do you think a lot of people just talk about, open up the system so we can see what the algorithms are asking for? We won't change them, but we'll make it more transparent. And then you can decide what sites you want to be on, or whether you want to use Twitter or not. That to create a whole apparatus to assess this is going to be impossible, and everybody's going to disagree about it. So just open it up and say, okay, take your chances.
Yeah, I mean, at the center, we don't take views on policy. And work really hard to maintain that. It's really, when we talk about sort of trust in institutions, we are one, right, that puts things out. And so it's a really important part of who we are and the way we do our work. I will say that certainly when we've done a lot of survey work around the question of privacy, which is a little bit different, but privacy in the digital space, and pulling content from you, and algorithms collecting stuff. And what we certainly have seen time and time again is a sense of skepticism and questioning, and saying that our privacy should be respected, right? People shouldn't be allowed to take this. But you couple that with both a sense also of confusion, of not understanding the different kinds of things that you can sign on to or not sign on to, or agree to or not agree to. A lot of confusion among the public about how this works, about what can I do, what sorts of things, how do they collect things. And in many cases, when there are choices that one can make, also that action's not taken, partly because it takes time, right? Partly because it's some commitment you have to make, and am I going to take the time to clear my cookies every week, and all that sort of stuff. So that sort of combination of this sense of, people are taking information I don't think I want them to take. I don't think that's right, but I also don't really understand it, and it would take a lot of time if I was going to try to control what I could myself. That's another sort of real tricky situation. A lot
of that is generational. When I talk to, my nieces and nephews, and you say, gee, don't put stuff online that identifies where you are and who you are. And they just go, oh, come on. We're just so past that. I don't even worry. So they just put it all out there.
Right. Everybody's going to get it anyway. So, it's another area of challenge.
One of the things I read the other day, so this is yet about another new digital startup. So it's from the New York Times and Bloomberg. Two guys are leaving their jobs, media columnists, actually, both named Smith. So it gets kind of confusing. But one of them actually put it this way. I was a bit startled. There are 200 million people who are college educated, who read in English, but who no one is really treating like an audience, but who talk to each other, and they talk to us. They want to be an audience, and they want somebody to respect them and not talk down to them. And both of these guys working for very traditional, well, Bloomberg less so, but mainstream media organizations say the media is not doing its job. It actually isn't talking to the audience in a respectful, intelligent way. And that's why they're taking these other options.
Yeah, it's interesting because, when some of the work that we've done, and this was particularly at the local level, but, I think carries through to national as well, or specific topic areas of news, in many cases, is that the public really desires a sense of connection with the organizations that they're relying on. And in many cases, they don't feel that connection. They say, I don't see myself represented. I don't feel connected. For local news, we had half of US adults say that the news that they got at the local level was mostly about areas outside where they lived. So, even like content wise, it's not about me and where I live.
Right.
That when you had a lower sense of connection to your news media, you had lower trust as well. A lot of those measures of sort of approval, of feeling good about my news sources were much higher if you felt a connection to them. Certainly that is an area where we have seen the public, put a lot of emphasis on.
Which is why local news, even though in general the numbers are going down, they garner, relatively speaking, more viewers than cable and network news. People want that.
And generally, a little bit higher trust overall. If you
Yeah.
ask about trust in local news outlets, national news outlets, friends and family, social media, your local outlets are still sitting at the top, about 5 percentage points higher than national at this point.
And you might know the person that's reading the news or giving you the weather.
Yeah, you might. Although it was about, I think it was 2 in 10. I may not have that figure exactly right, that said they had ever spoken to a journalist in their life. So it is a fairly, depending on how you read it, it's a small number, or it's like, well, 2 in 10 have actually spoken to a journalist.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a minority of the population.
And the trends, some of the things I read on Twitter, and I don't know if this is new or not, but you were certainly touching on it, that people are less and less expressing their opinions, except for a small, very vocal minority, and more responding, which I read to mean they're liking something, putting a little heart on it, as opposed to saying, here's my view.
When we look at social media behavior overall, and we've looked at this both when, in the early days of Facebook and Twitter, more than once, people are more likely to take something in, to be receivers, than to post things themselves. So it is generally a smaller part of the population and segment that's in those spaces that's actually actively posting, whether it's opinion or not. I'm not sure if there was that distinction there, but content in general, the posting tends to be done among a smaller segment of the population. Now, Facebook has certainly gotten more, has a much broader reach at this point now. But we have found that both on Twitter for posting in general and, posting when it comes to news, that there's a smaller segment that are doing leading most of that activity.
So what do you see as an overall trend here? Okay, Zuckerberg of Facebook used to be a hero. Now he's a bum in many quarters and being called up in front of congressional committees and people thinking he's too rich and making too much money. At Jack walking away from Twitter. Where do you see? I mean, are people getting kind of tired of these forms? Do they want it more sophisticated? Are you seeing anything on that front at all?
In terms of use, when we ask people about use of social media, it's a large segment of the population that's getting some news there in the US. When we ask about the trust, it's in news they get from social media. Again, going back to what I was talking about, local news, national news, friends and family, social media, that's at the basement. Single percentages that say they have a lot of trust in the news they're getting from social media. Most also tend to say it doesn't really help them be more informed. When we ask about this broadly, it's either just doing not much, or it's actually making me more confused about what's happening.
Yeah.
But at the same time, people are going there. So, and they may have gripes with the way it functions, but they're still going there largely because it's so convenient. It's such a convenient, and you do other stuff there as well. So news is a part. Most all of these social media so far that we've studied that are part of this, kind of the main social media mix were not created initially as centers of news. They were created as social platforms, and news became a part of it because it's a part of what people do. So there is still a very wide reach, even if there is skepticism among the audience about the news and information that they're getting there.
And then you see things like Instagram grow because that is about family, and here are the kids, and you can control who reads it, and it isn't about politics.
But then news can become a part of that. There is certainly, let's see, where Instagram is 11% of the population that gets news, says that they regularly get news on the site, 41% that are accessing it generally. So that's certainly grown in its new, in the portion of its audience that are getting news there. So in many cases, it does become a part of it. I think there was just something in the news too about one of these subsets within Instagram that is focused on news that they're going to be adding to.
Of course, they're going to do that and use it. Okay, I took one of your surveys last night. So I will first say that I am, coming at this as a Canadian, not an American. So I couldn't answer all of the questions. But here's what was troubling. I became part of category 7, which is a stressed sideliner. With mixed political views. The one thing that was accurate was kind of, not connected to either one of the of your two main parties directly, but a low interest in politics, which is not true, except maybe if you're counting frustration level.
That's interesting. Yeah, I can't. So what you took was a quiz. So it actually,
one of your quizzes that I went online.
It's the surveys are by the members of ATP, as I was
saying.
Yes,
no, I wasn't an official
quiz that's available to it, and then it segments you. I can't say why, particularly why you landed that. It is certainly focused on the U.S. population, so I don't know if that had something to do with it.
But I really thought it was an interesting category type, which is stressed sideliners, because it does actually represent an awful lot of people who are a pox on all your houses, and please just do what we sent you there to do, fix some problems and quit talking.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting. One of the things that I want to explore in our research in this coming year is sort of the news disengaged, if you will. And for a long time in the past, that segment of the population were just people who just, I don't know, they just don't pay that much attention. They're just not, it's just not, they're not super engaged in society generally. That, they just sort of are bystanders. I think what I'm curious to see now is if there are different types of the population that are disengaged by choice, right? We're choosing to push this way. I'm still engaged in a lot of other ways. There are a lot of things I'm connected to, a lot of ways I keep up with different things. But I am choosing to push news away for one reason or another. So I think that's going to be a really interesting area to explore.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because I just have people in all categories, all political stripes, all ages saying, it doesn't answer my questions. I need to go, which is what everybody tuned into the news and, at 6:30 or 11 or whenever it was. And you got the 15 things you needed to know about if you lived in the world that day, with editors assessing that. And that just seems to be gone. And
it's, it wasn't a perfect world before. I think it's very fair to say for sure too. There was only a handful of places that you could choose, and they were making the decision about what you were going to hear. So certainly there's a lot more choice of what is it that I want to learn about and find out about, and what are the, who are the voices I want to listen to. That has a myriad of different implications in society today.
It's very simplistic, and for that reason I hate to refer to it, but in the old days with so few sources, there was more commonality. You would watch the news at night, or you would read your newspaper, and people would come to work and they would talk about the funny story, the kicker at the end of the news, or there was a common bond. Now there is no common bond because nobody across our nation or yours is watching the same source at the same time in the way they used to.
Yeah, it's hard. It's certainly, I think one of the questions is, what does all this mean for a functioning democracy, for a functioning society, for listening to each other, for hearing each other? Again, not that there were things that were, necessarily perfect, 3 or 4 decades ago, but where are we today? And when you look at where we are today, what does that mean for the way society is going to function or not function?
Or not function. We will come back to you if you will let us, and talk with you as you do this research and figure out what it does mean for citizenry, for democracy, and for our political process. Really interesting, your insights on this. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Amy Mitchell, Director of Journalism Research at the Pew Research Center. Dedicated her life to this, and it's interesting to get inside your head as you get inside of ours and figure out where the trends are headed. Thanks again for being with us, and that's it for this edition of No Nonsense.